Hi there, this is Teri from stampinmagic.com. Welcome back to my channel. Today's project is this beautiful shaker card. I've used the Floral Frames stamp set and coordinating dies and some of our Tranquil Textures designer series paper. Let's get started. I'm going to begin by stamping the front panel for my card. I have some Whisper White cardstock here, and this is the Floral Frames stamp set, and I'm going to use the largest frame. A bit later on I'll also be using the Hello sentiment and the two groupings of flowers. I will also use Memento Tuxedo black ink for all the stamping. I'm going to use my Stampin' Magic tool to help me position my image. Now, unfortunately, Stampin' Up no longer sells this tool, but you can buy it elsewhere. I do have another video that shows you how to use the Stampin' Magic, and I'll put a link to this at the top of the screen. But you could use any stamp positioning tool to help you position your image. Or of course you could just go freestyle. So I've already stamped my frame onto the plastic imaging sheet, and I've used that to determine where I need to place my handle. I'm inking up my stamp, and then I'm going to position my stamp into the handle and stamp it down. I'm using more of our normal weight Whisper White cardstock for the rest of the stamping, and I need to stamp another frame and also the two groupings of flowers. I'm going to emboss my sentiment, so I have another piece of our normal weight Whisper White cardstock, and I'm using my embossing buddy just to remove any static there. I'm using VersaFine ink, which is an intense black ink that stays wet long enough to emboss with. So I'm just stamping my sentiment into the centre of that card and then covering with clear embossing powder before heat setting with my heat tool. I'm using an aqua painter and the ink pads for the colouring today. This way I can match the colours in the designer series paper exactly. I'm starting with the Tranquil Tide, and I'm going to colour some of the leaves. Now I'm only going to colour the items that will show on this frame, that I'm not going to cut out from the second frame that I stamped. This will become clear a bit later on. So I just want to colour some of the leaves, and initially I'm just laying down a light layer. When that's done, I'll pick up some of the darker colour from the lid of my ink pad and just go in on the base of each of the leaves, just to add a little dimension to make it a bit more interesting. The only other thing I'm going to colour on this front panel are the little floral sprigs, and I'm going to use Fresh Fig ink for this. For the colouring on the second frame that I stamped, I want to colour everything that I'll cut out, so the rest of the leaves and also the flowers themselves. Now for the flowers, I'm going to use Balmy Blue. Again, initially I'm just going to cover all the flowers with a light layer, and then I'll go back into the ink pad and pick up some darker colour and just go through and highlight each of the petals, just to give them a little dimension. I'm going to use Mint Macaron ink for the remaining leaves. And exactly as I did before, I'll first go in and cover everything with a light layer, and then pick up some darker ink and add some highlights afterwards. I'm going to use a couple of the foliage framelits to cut out the little groups of flowers. Then I'm also going to use a couple of the layering circle framelit dies. Now you want to take out the third and fourth largest of these. Now the smaller of these two I'm going to use to cut out the aperture in the front panel, and then the larger of the two I'm going to use to cut my window sheet or acetate. The images I coloured on the second frame will all be cut out by hand in two sections. Now that everything's been cut out, we can start to put the card together. Now the two floral sections that I hand cut, those will eventually be placed on top of the front panel, but I'm going to do that a little bit later. The first thing I want to do is cover the aperture with some window sheet or acetate. So I have a square of acetate here that measures 3 inches by 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters squared, and I'm going to attach it to my front panel over that aperture using some tearing tape. So I'm going to add this all around the edges and then remove the backing and add it to the back of that front panel. To finish off the front of this panel, I have a small piece of the Tranquil Textures Designer Series paper, and I've cut it to size just to fit the bottom of that panel. On the top of the pattern paper I want to add a scalloped border, and I'm using my decorative ribbon border punch to do this. So I have a strip of Night of Navy cardstock and I'm just punching the centre, and then I'm lining up the pattern that I've just punched out with the pattern on the base plate of the punch itself. You continue doing this until you've punched a strip that's long enough for your card. You can then add some glue to the top section of your Designer Series paper and stick it to your border punch out. Then trim off the excess at the sides, add glue all over the reverse and position it onto your front panel. To create the frame that's going to hold all our shaker sprinkles, I'm using one of our foam strips. Now these are more than long enough to go all the way around the edge of this circle, and you can do it in one go. You don't have to cut little pieces and join them up together. You can gently curve the strip around the circle. I'm not going right to the edge of the circle, I'm just a tiny bit back from the aperture edge, possibly about 1 or 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch-ish back. I'm including several things for the shaker particles. First of all, I've got sequins from the metallic sequins assortment, and I've pulled out various sizes in silver and the iridescent ones, And then I'm using the Tranquil Textures sprinkles, and these include beads and little pebbles that are great for shaker cards. You have to be careful though with these because some of the pebbles are quite large, so you don't want to include those. And then I've also added a few of the mini sequins, the silver ones from our mini sequin trim. You just put everything into the middle of that frame that you've created and then remove the backing from the foam strips. And then I've got that circle of window sheet that I created earlier using my layering circle framelit, and I'm just adding that on top and giving it a good press down. And that's the shaker element finished. Now to add the sentiment panel to the card, and I've just trimmed it down here to about 3 inches squared, which is 7.5 centimeters. I'm going to glue it in place using the Tombow multipurpose adhesive, and all I'm doing is adding a thin line of glue around the outside edge of that acetate circle that I've just positioned. You want to make this as thin as you possibly can so it doesn't ooze when you press it down into place. So I'm just making sure my sentiment is straight, and then I'm going to stick my shaker panel down on top of it. Now once you're happy with the positioning, you just want to leave it alone for a minute or so to make sure it's thoroughly dry. And once you're sure it's completely dry, just flip it over and cut away all the excess card from that sentiment panel. Now we need to build up the back of this panel so it's a level surface, and I'm using more foam strips for this. And the first thing I'm going to do is to go round all the edges with full lengths of foam strips. Okay, you don't want to use little pieces for the edges because the edges will show when you look at the side of your card, so you want them to be as neat as possible, and the way to do this is to use full strips. You also don't want to put these strips right on the edge of the card. Just come in a millimetre or two. Your finished result will look much better for it. Once you've done the edges, you can go ahead and fill in all the gaps, and for this you can use any little odd scrap pieces that you have. Now I'm going to add the 2 floral sections that I hand cut earlier to the front of the card. So I'm just adding glue to the back, and I'll position each of those, matching it up with the stamped frame. The 2 remaining floral pieces that we die cut earlier can now be added to the card, but I want to shape these a little first. And I'm just using, it's like a large embossing tool. I think it's for cake decoration or something like that. It's just like a large embossing tool, and I'm just putting the flowers onto my foam mat, and then with a circular motion I'm running the embossing tool over the center of each flower, and this just makes the petals curl up. and then I'm going to add glue to the reverse and position them onto the frame. The group of 3 flowers was just a little bit trickier. I had to just snip between the flowers where they weren't joined just to help those petals curl up, and then again I'm using my tool just to apply pressure to the center, and that curls the petals a little bit. If you haven't got one of these tools, you could use the back end of a biro or something similar. It just needs to be largish and curved. You don't want anything too narrow because that will tear your card. To finish off the front of this card, I'm going to add a basic rhinestone to each of the flowers. For my card base, I have half a sheet of A4 cardstock cut and scored to create a portrait card. Of course, you can use half a sheet of 8.5 by 11. Then I have a panel of balmy blue, and for the inside of the card I have a panel of Whisper White. I also have a strip of Night of Navy cardstock and a tiny strip of Tranquil Textures Designer Series paper. I'm going to add this paper to the strip of Night of Navy, just so there's a thin border along the top showing of the Night of Navy. And then I'm going to cut this down to the size I want. This can then be glued to the bottom of the white panel, and then this section can be glued to the inside of the card. The balmy blue mat can be added to the front of the card base. Finally, all the backings from the foam strips can be removed. Glue can be added to the back of that sentiment panel, and then we can position this onto the balmy blue mat. And then we're done. The card's complete. I hope you give this style of card a go. It's very simple to do and a fairly quick card to make, really. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this project. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Bye for now.